Who did you steal these motorcycles from?
Careful, officer. Every word matters. I save lives all night. This is my bike. You just handcuffed a doctor.
The cruiser's lights came on before either sister had done a single thing wrong. Officer Brett Dalton had been watching them from the moment they turned onto Clearwater Avenue. Two black women on matching red and black sport bikes, moving clean and steady through the Saturday morning quiet. He didn't like the picture. He gunned the engine. He chased them for 2 full blocks before forcing them to the curb. Then he climbed out, slowly walked up to the first bike and said it with a smile. "Step off, both of you, right now." 2 black girls on $20,000 bikes in this zip code. Somebody somewhere is missing something, and I'm looking right at it. The first sister started to speak. Dalton cut her off without blinking. "Save it, sweetheart. I've heard every story. Black girl, nice bike, clean plates, that just means you were smart about it. Doesn't mean it's yours." When the second sister reached slowly into her jacket pocket for her hospital ID, Dalton grabbed her wrist and laughed. "Oh, don't tell me. Let me guess. You're a doctor. Right. And your sister's probably the president." He laughed at his own joke. Nobody else on that street did. One of those women had spent the last 12 hours in an emergency room saving lives. The other had spent 2 years putting dirty cops exactly like him behind bars. He didn't know any of that yet, but within 6 hours, he would wish he had never turned those lights on. Stay with this story all the way through. It only gets more powerful from here. Drop your city and your local time in the comments right now. You never know who near you is watching this, feeling exactly what you're feeling. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe and hit the bell. We have more coming. Hey y'all. Every mile I travel reminds me there are still good people in this world. Come sit for a minute. Zara and Imani Cole were born 11 minutes apart on a Thursday morning in March, 32 years ago at Eastfield General Hospital. The same hospital where Imani would one day perform her first solo trauma surgery, and where the nursing staff would eventually hang a small framed photograph of her in the break room, because they said she made the night shifts feel survivable. Their mother, Ruth Cole, was a 5th-grade teacher who graded papers at the kitchen table every evening under a single lamp. Her red pen moving steadily through crooked sentences and misspelled words with the patience of someone who understood that children were not finished things. Their father, Leonard Cole, was a licensed electrician who left the house before sunrise 6 days a week and came home smelling of copper wire and honest work. He died of a heart attack when the twins were 19, still wearing his work boots, still owing nothing to anyone. Ruth raised them on 3 principles. Work harder than the room expects. Speak clearly when it matters. And never let anyone convince you that your presence requires an apology. Both daughters had listened. Zara went to Howard University on an academic scholarship, then to Georgetown Law, where she finished in the top 4% of her class. She had been an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District for 3 years, now handling public corruption cases with the kind of focused patience that made defense attorneys nervous and made her supervisors quietly grateful. She was 32 years old, 5'7", and had a habit of writing everything down in a small black notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, because she had learned early that memory alone was never enough in a courtroom. Imani took a different road to the same altitude. Johns Hopkins on a pre-med scholarship, then a surgical residency at Mercy General that nearly broke her twice and made her harder and more precise in ways she was still understanding. She was now an ER trauma surgeon at Eastfield Medical Center, working rotating shifts that started at 7 in the evening and ended whenever the last critical patient was stable. She had been on shift the night before the Saturday in question, finishing at 6:45 in the morning after a 12-hour stretch that included 2 stab wounds, 1 pediatric head trauma, and a cardiac arrest she had pulled back from the edge with her own hands. She had driven home, changed into riding gear, and texted Zara one word, ready. This was their ritual. Every Saturday that their schedules allowed, the two of them took Highway 9 out of the city, looped through the quieter county roads where the traffic thinned and the tree lines pressed close on both sides, and ended at a small breakfast place called Nell's Table on Route 14, where the owner knew their order without asking and the coffee was strong enough to matter. It was the one part of the week that belonged entirely to them. No caseloads, no patient charts, no institutional weight pressing down. Just the road and the bikes and the particular silence that exists between two people who have known each other since before language. The bikes were Kawasaki Ninja ZX6Rs, matching, red and black. Zara had bought hers 22 months ago, after saving carefully for 8 months. Imani had bought hers 4 months later, partly because she wanted one, and partly because the idea of Zara riding alone on long stretches of highway made her quietly anxious in a way she never fully admitted. Both bikes were registered in their names, fully insured, inspected, and legal in every particular. The paperwork lived in the side compartments of each bike in waterproof pouches because their father had taught them that documentation was a form of protection long before either of them understood what that meant. They left Imani's apartment complex on Davenport Street at 8:14 that Saturday morning. The weather was clear and mild, the kind of late spring morning that made the city feel briefly forgiving. They rode east toward Clearwater's Avenue, a wide residential boulevard lined with oak trees and older brick homes, because it was the cleanest route to the highway entrance, and the traffic at that hour was almost nothing. They had made it 4 blocks down Clearwater when Zara noticed the cruiser. It was parked at the corner of Clearwater and 9th Engine running facing their direction. She saw it the way she saw most things registered. It filed, it kept moving. She was not doing anything wrong. She had nothing to adjust. The cruiser pulled out 30 seconds after they passed it. It didn't activate its lights immediately. It followed them for nearly 2 full blocks, close enough that Zara could see the outline of the driver in her mirror, close enough that the following felt intentional rather than coincidental. She kept her speed exactly at the posted limit, checked her mirrors again. Then the lights came on. Both sisters pulled to the curb immediately, cleanly, without hesitation, the way people do when they have nothing to hide and have spent their whole lives being told that compliance is safety. Officer Brett Dalton stepped out of the cruiser before it had fully stopped rocking. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the particular kind of confidence that came not from competence, but from years of operating in spaces where no one had ever pushed back. He did not approach with caution. He approached with ownership, as if the street and everything on it already belonged to him, and the 2 women on the bikes were simply objects that had appeared in his inventory without explanation. He didn't ask for license or registration. He walked directly to Zara's bike, placed his hand flat on the seat, and looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already decided is out of place. "Step off, both of you, right now." 2 black girls on $20,000 bikes in this zip code. Somebody somewhere is missing something, and I'm looking right at it. Zara's hands were still on the handlebars. She did not move for 1 full second, not from fear, but from the particular stillness of a person who is already cataloging everything. Then she swung her leg off. The bike stood up straight and said very calmly, "Officer, may I ask the reason for this stop?" Dalton smiled like the question was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "Yeah, you can ask." He didn't answer, and somewhere across the street, behind the low hedge of a front yard, on the north side of Clearwater Avenue, a man named Marcus Webb set down his pruning shears, reached into his back pocket, and quietly pressed record. 3 more cruisers arrived within 4 minutes. Nobody had called for backup in any official sense. No radio dispatch, no code, no documented request. They simply appeared, one after another, turning onto Clearwater Avenue from different directions, as if the street had been quietly flagged on some internal map that only certain officers could read. The last one pulled up over the curb, with its front tire resting on the grass strip between the sidewalk and the road, which struck Zara as unnecessary and deliberate at the same time. 6 officers total now, 2 women on sport bikes. Dalton didn't acknowledge the new arrivals with any particular urgency. He just glanced back once the way a man glances at reinforcements he already knew were coming, and then turned back to Zara with the same unhurried expression. "You were saying something about a reason," he said. Zara kept her voice level. "Yes, I'd like to know the legal basis for this stop." "Matching a description." "What description?" "Suspicious activity in the area." "What activity specifically?" Dalton tilted his head slightly. "You always talk this much during a traffic stop, or is this a special occasion?" Imani had stepped off her bike and was standing 2 feet to Zara's left. She had removed her helmet. Her hospital badge from Eastfield Medical was still clipped to the chest pocket of her jacket. She had forgotten to take it off when she changed into her riding gear that morning, and it had been there the whole time visible, with her photograph and full name and department printed clearly on its face. She held it toward Dalton now with 2 fingers, offering it without drama. "My name is Dr. Imani Cole. I'm a trauma surgeon at Eastfield Medical Center. I've been on shift since 7 last night. This is my sister. We live in this city. These are our bikes." Dalton looked at the badge the way someone looks at a piece of mail addressed to the wrong house. Then he reached into his jacket pocket for a small black notepad. "Anybody can print a badge," he said, and began writing. Something moved across Imani's face. It was not anger, not yet. It was something older and quieter, the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent their entire professional life being the most qualified person in a room and still being asked to prove it to men who had already decided the answer. She said nothing. She put the badge back. Zara had reached slowly toward the side compartment of her bike to retrieve the registration. One of the officers behind Dalton took 3 fast steps forward. His hand went to his belt. "Hands where I can see them." Zara stopped moving. Both hands came up open at shoulder height. "I was reaching for my registration. The compartment is on the right side of the bike. I will move slowly. Tuku, step away from the vehicle. I am trying to provide the documentation you're asking for." I said, "Step away." She stepped away. Dalton moved to the compartment himself, unlatched it without asking, and pulled out the registration paperwork and insurance card. He looked at both for approximately 4 seconds. Then he folded them in half and put them in his own jacket pocket without comment. Zara watched him do it. "Those are my documents. They're evidence now." To evidence of what? Dalton looked at her over his shoulder. "That's what we're figuring out." It was at that moment that Imani reached into her own jacket for her phone. She was not moving quickly. She was not raising her voice. She simply wanted to call their mother or a colleague or anyone who could document what was happening from a position that Dalton could not dismiss or pocket. She never got to make the call. Officer Kyle Mercer, the youngest of the group, barely 27, still carrying the uncertain energy of someone not yet fully comfortable in the uniform, stepped forward and took the phone out of her hand. Not violently, but firmly and without asking. "I'll hold on to that," he said. Imani looked at him. "You don't have the right to take my phone." Mercer looked away. He didn't argue with her. He also didn't give it back. What happened next took less than 8 seconds. Dalton told Imani to turn around and place her hands behind her back. When she asked why, he said non-compliance. When she said she had not refused any lawful order, he stepped behind her without another word, took hold of her right wrist, and pulled it backward and upward with enough force that she gasped, and her body bent forward involuntarily. The cuff went on. Zara moved instinctively one step forward, one hand extended not in aggression, but in the reflexive motion of a person watching her sister be hurt. 2 officers were on her before she completed the step. Her arms were pulled behind her. She felt the cold metal close around her wrists before she had finished saying, "She hasn't done anything." Both women were in cuffs on the sidewalk of Clearwater Avenue on a clear Saturday morning in May in front of the oak trees and the brick houses, and the neighbors watching through their windows who had not come outside yet because they did not know if that would help or make things worse. The 2 red and black motorcycles stood at the curb, engines off side by side. An unmarked flatbed truck turned onto Clearwater Avenue from the south end of the block. It moved without hurry toward the bikes. Imani saw it first. Her voice came out low and controlled despite the angle of her arms and the pain in her wrist. Zara. Zara had already seen it. "I know," she said quietly. The truck belonged to Apex Towing, and it had arrived before anyone on that street had made a single official call. The Eastfield Police Department's 4th Precinct sat on the corner of Montgomery Boulevard and 5th Street, a flat-faced concrete building that had been built in 1987 and renovated twice since, without ever quite losing the institutional gray of its original walls. The lobby smelled of burned coffee and floor wax, and the particular staleness of a space where unhappy people spent too much time waiting. Zara and Imani were brought in through the side entrance at 9:17 in the morning, walked separately through a narrow corridor, and placed in 2 different interview rooms on opposite ends of the building. The separation was not accidental. Zara recognized it immediately for what it was, a deliberate structural choice designed to prevent coordination, to isolate, to make each person feel more alone than she actually was. She sat in room C and began doing the only thing available to her. She memorized everything. The time she entered, 9:19. The name on the officer's badge who walked her in T. Grover. The number of ceiling tiles, 14. The single camera mounted in the upper right corner with a small red light that indicated it was recording. The scratched initials on the corner of the table. The fact that the room was cold, not uncomfortably cold, but deliberately cool, the kind of temperature that made sitting still for a long time quietly draining. She asked for her phone call at 9:22. The officer at the door said someone would be with her shortly. She asked again at 9:31. He said the same thing. She asked a third time at 9:48, and this time added clearly and without raising her voice. "I am an assistant U.S. attorney. My bar number is 447-1829. I am entitled to a phone call, and I am entitled to know the charges against me. I would like both of those things documented in writing." The officer left without responding. She waited. She kept counting time in her head because they had taken her phone, and there was no clock on the wall. Another detail she noted, another detail she stored. She used the edge of her thumbnail to scratch small marks into the paper cup they had given her with lukewarm water, 1 mark for every 5 minutes she estimated had passed. By the time Sergeant Frank Odell came through the door, there were 9 marks on the cup. Odell was 61 years old, 22 years on the force, the kind of career officer who had outlasted 4 police chiefs and 3 major departmental reforms without ever quite being the subject of any of them. He was heavy-set, with close-cropped gray hair, and the practiced expression of a man who had conducted enough of these conversations to have developed a reliable performance of reasonableness. He set a folder on the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down with the careful unhurriedness of someone who wanted her to feel that he was doing her a favor by being there at all. "I'm Ms. Cole," he said. "It's Attorney Cole," Zara replied. Odell opened the folder without acknowledging the correction. "You were stopped this morning on Clearwater Avenue in connection with a report of suspicious activity involving high-value vehicles in the area. You and your companion failed to comply with lawful officer instructions, which resulted in— That is not accurate, Zara said. Her voice was even. I complied with every instruction I was given. My sister complied with every instruction she was given. We were not informed of any specific report. No report number was provided when I asked for one. My registration documents were removed from my possession by Officer Dalton without a receipt or documentation of any kind. And my sister was physically restrained with enough force to cause visible injury to her wrist before any formal charge was stated. Odell looked at her over the folder. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. He was adjusting his model of the conversation. You said you're an attorney, he said. I said I'm an assistant U.S. attorney, Eastern District. I have been for 3 years. That's so. Yes. He wrote something down. Then he looked back up with the same measured expression. And where did you get the money for those motorcycles? The question landed the way it was intended to, like an implication wrapped in procedural language shaped to sound almost neutral, almost administrative, almost like something he was simply required to ask. Zara did not flinch. I earned it. Would you like my bank records, or is the question rhetorical? Odell closed the folder. I'm going to need you to wait here a little longer while we verify some information. What information? Standard procedure. I'd like that procedure documented by name and code number, please. He stood up, picked up the folder and walked to the door without answering. Then he paused with his hand on the frame. You know, he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man who wanted to sound like he was helping. This goes a lot easier when people just let us do our jobs. You can do your job, Zara said. I'd like you to do it correctly. The door closed. She sat for a moment in the silence of room C. Then she smoothed the paper cup flat on the table, turned it over to the blank side, and began writing. She had no pen. She found a broken plastic clip on the floor near the table leg, the kind that falls off a name badge, and used its sharp end to press letters into the paper with enough pressure to leave readable impressions. Time. Names. Words. Sequence. She wrote everything. 40 feet down the corridor and through 2 locked doors, Imani sat alone in room A, with her injured wrist resting on the table in front of her, a bruise already darkening across the bone, and a medical mind that was quietly, systematically cataloging every symptom and every minute without anyone in that building knowing she was doing it. Neither sister knew yet that across town on a residential sidewalk in front of a hedge on the north side of Clearwater Avenue, a man named Marcus Webb had just uploaded 41 seconds of video to his phone, and that the view count was already climbing faster than anyone in the 4th Precinct was prepared for. Marcus Webb had not intended to become part of anything larger than his Saturday morning. He was 44 years old, a self-employed landscaper who had been maintaining the yards on the north side of Clearwater Avenue for 11 years. He knew the street the way people know things they have tended carefully, which oak roots were lifting the sidewalk slabs, which corner drained poorly after rain, which houses kept dogs that needed a few minutes to settle before he could work near the fence. He was not a man who looked for trouble or inserted himself into situations that did not concern him. But he had a daughter who was 20 years old and drove a used Honda Civic she had bought herself with 2 summers of waitressing money. And when he watched Officer Dalton put his hand on that motorcycle seat and say what he said, something in him went very still and very certain at the same time. He pressed record at 8:26 in the morning. He kept recording for 41 seconds without moving, without speaking, standing behind the low hedge with the phone held at chest height and his breathing deliberately slow. The video captured Dalton's words clearly. It captured the moment Imani extended her hospital badge, and Dalton looked at it and said anybody could print a badge. It captured Mercer taking Imani's phone. It captured both women being cuffed on the sidewalk. and it captured at the very end in the right corner of the frame the Apex towing truck turning onto Clearwater Avenue before a single official call had been made. He uploaded it at 8:51 sitting in his truck, with the engine off to 3 different platforms simultaneously, because his daughter had taught him that redundancy was how things survived on the internet. By 10:30 that morning, the video had been viewed 47,000 times. By 11:47, it had crossed 2.1 million. The comments were not measured or careful. They were the sound of people who recognized something, not a new thing, not a shocking thing, but a documented thing, a thing with a face and a name and a timestamp, a thing that had been happening quietly for years and had now been given the one element it had always been denied proof that could not be dismissed. The hashtag Chokcha Free Zara Imani appeared at 11:03, posted by a law student in Atlanta who had seen the video and recognized Zara's name from a public corruption case she had studied in class. Within 20 minutes, it was being used by 12,000 accounts. Within an hour, it had crossed the feed of Councilwoman Diane Pruitt, who was sitting at her kitchen table eating a late breakfast and reading her weekend briefing notes when her phone began producing the particular pattern of vibrations that meant something had broken through the ordinary noise. She watched the video twice. Then she called Chief Patricia Haywood directly, not the department's main line, not a staffer, but Haywood's personal cell number, which Pruitt had saved after a joint community meeting 8 months earlier. Haywood answered on the second ring. "Patricia," Pruitt said, "tell me you've already seen this." Chief Patricia Haywood was 56 years old, 28 years in law enforcement, the first black woman to hold the chief position in Eastfield's history, and the third woman overall. She had built her career on the principle that accountability was not the enemy of good policing. It was the precondition for it. She had not yet seen the video when Pruitt called. She watched it on her laptop while Pruitt stayed on the line and said nothing. When it ended, Haywood was quiet for 4 seconds. Where are they?" she asked. "4th Precinct," Pruitt said. "Since before 9. Haywood was already standing up. "I'm going in." She arrived at the 4th Precinct at 12:14. She did not call ahead. She walked through the front entrance in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray coat, no uniform, and asked the desk officer for the incident report on the Clearwater Avenue stop from that morning. The desk officer looked up, looked at her, and went pale. "Chief Haywood." "Yes, ma'am. One moment." She waited at the desk with both hands flat on the counter, her expression professionally neutral while the officer made 2 internal calls, and the lobby grew incrementally quieter as people registered who was standing there and why. Sergeant Odell appeared from the back hallway 4 minutes later with a manila folder and the expression of a man who had already begun calculating his position. "Chief," he said. "I wasn't expecting the report," she said. He handed her the folder. She opened it. She read for approximately 90 seconds. Then she looked up. "What's the report number for the suspicious vehicle activity that initiated this stop?" Odell's jaw shifted slightly. "We're still, the documentation is being finalized. The stop occurred at approximately 8:20 this morning. It's now past noon. Where is the source report?" "Officer Dalton observed the vehicles exhibiting—" "I didn't ask what Officer Dalton observed. I asked for the report number." Odell said nothing. The lobby had gone completely silent. Haywood closed the folder and asked for the body camera footage from every officer present at the scene. Odell told her that Dalton's camera had malfunctioned. She asked about the other 5 officers. He said the footage was being reviewed. She asked to speak with both women immediately. Odell told her that the interviews were ongoing. Haywood looked at him for a long moment, with the stillness of someone who had just confirmed something she had hoped not to confirm. Frank, she said quietly enough that only he could hear it. How long have you been running this? Odell's face did not change, but his right hand tightened around the folder he was still holding, and that small movement told her everything she needed to know before he answered. He didn't answer. Haywood took out her own phone and made a call. FBI Special Agent Darius Monk picked up on the first ring as if he had been waiting. Darius, she said. I think we have a bigger problem here than one bad stop. Agent Darius Monk had been with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for 9 years, and he had learned early that the most dangerous criminal operations were rarely the loudest ones. The loudest ones? The dramatic ones? The ones that made headlines and generated task forces, those were usually already half collapsed by the time federal attention arrived. The dangerous ones were the quiet ones, the ones that ran smoothly for years because they were built on relationships, on procedural language, on the gap between what the paperwork said and what actually happened. The ones where every individual piece looked almost legitimate if you examined it in isolation. The ones where nobody inside the system had any incentive to look at all the pieces at once. When Haywood called him at 12:19 that Saturday, Monk was in his home office reviewing a separate matter. He pulled up the video of Clearwater Avenue on his second monitor while she was still talking, and by the time she finished her sentence, I think we have a bigger problem here than one bad stop. He had already opened the 4th Precinct's public record of vehicular stops from the past 8 months and begun running a simple filter. What came back stopped him mid-motion. 11 stops involving high-value sport bikes or luxury vehicles in a 2-mile corridor anchored by Clearwater Avenue. All 11 in the past 8 months. All 11 resulting in the vehicle being towed. 9 of the 11 drivers were black. Of those 9, 6 had professional credentials, 3 held graduate degrees. 1 was a nurse practitioner, 1 owned a licensed contracting business, 1 was a retired military officer with a spotless record. None of the 11 had resulted in a filed charge that survived more than 2 weeks. All 11 vehicles had been towed by the same company. Apex Towing and Recovery registered address at 4471 Industrial Corridor Road, Eastfield. Monk set down his coffee and pulled the business registration for Apex. The company had been operating for 6 years. Its towing contract with the Eastfield Police Department had been renewed 18 months ago in a single vendor process with no competitive bidding on record. The renewal had been signed by the department's administrative division, which at that time was overseen by Sergeant Frank Odell in his secondary administrative capacity. Monk pulled Odell's financial disclosures, which public employees were required to file annually. He cross-referenced them against the state's business registry and 3 banking databases that federal investigators had access to through a standing data-sharing agreement. It took him 22 minutes to find it. Eastfield Consulting, LLC. Registered 18 months ago, 4 weeks before the Apex contract renewal. Listed business purpose, operational logistics, and advisory services. Sole registered agent, a name Monk did not immediately recognize. But the registered address of Eastfield Consulting LLC was a mailbox service on Pendleton Street, the same mailbox service whose address appeared on 4 of Apex Towing's vendor correspondence documents. He pulled Odell's most recent financial disclosure. There it was, listed under secondary income consulting fees from Eastfield Consulting LLC. $41,500 over 14 months. Monk leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. Then he called Haywood back. Patricia, I need everything you can get me on Officer Brett Dalton and Sergeant Frank Odell without triggering any internal alerts. Don't go through normal channels. Don't let this touch the precinct's internal system. How bad is it? She asked. I don't have the full shape yet, but it's not spontaneous. It's structural. He was at the 4th Precinct by 2:15 in the afternoon, entering through the administrative side entrance with his credentials and a folder that contained enough preliminary documentation to initiate a formal federal inquiry. Haywood met him at the door. They spoke for 9 minutes in her temporary office before she had Zara and Imani released. The release itself was not dramatic. No announcement, no explanation. An officer simply opened the door to room C at 2:31 and told Zara she could go. Zara stood up, smoothed the front of her jacket, picked up the flattened paper cup covered in pressed impressions, and folded it carefully into her pocket before walking out. Imani was waiting in the corridor with her wrist wrapped in a thin piece of gauze that a precinct medic had applied after Haywood insisted the bruising now a deep purple-green across the outer bone. When she saw Zara, neither of them spoke immediately. They stood for a moment in the narrow hallway, close enough that their shoulders touched, absorbing the particular relief of people who had each spent 5 hours not knowing exactly how the other was doing. Then Imani said quietly, "They took my phone. I know, we'll get it back. My wrist is documented." "Good. I have the timeline in my head, every minute. I have mine on a paper cup." Imani looked at her. A paper cup. It was available. The outside air hit them at 2:38. Ruth Cole was standing on the sidewalk in front of the precinct in a yellow blouse and dark slacks. Her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and her hands folded in front of her with the deliberate composure of a woman who had been holding herself together through force of will for over 5 hours. She had arrived at the precinct at 11:20 and had been turned away from the entrance 3 separate times by 3 different officers who told her that no visitors were permitted during active processing. She had not left. She had stood on the public sidewalk with her phone and her composure and waited. When she saw her daughters come through the door, something in her face changed, not collapsed, not broken, but released the way a held breath releases. She opened her arms, and both of them walked into them at the same time. And for a moment, the 3 of them stood together on the sidewalk in front of the 4th precinct, while the afternoon traffic moved past on Montgomery Boulevard, and nobody inside that building came out to explain or apologize or acknowledge what had happened. Monk watched from just inside the glass doors. He noted the bruise on Imani's wrist. He noted the paper cup Zara had not let go of. Then he turned and walked back toward Odell's office because the shape of the operation was becoming clearer by the minute. And there was one more piece he needed to locate before he could say he understood the full architecture of what had been built inside this precinct. That piece had a name, Dr. Raymond Osei. And what had happened to Dr. Osei's car 3 weeks earlier would change the entire dimension of the case. Officer Kyle Mercer had not slept the night before the Clearwater Avenue stop. He had been awake most of Friday night, sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of water he kept refilling and not drinking, turning over the same thought in different directions, without ever arriving at a place that felt like solid ground. He had been on the force for 2 years and 3 months. He had joined because his uncle was a retired detective who talked about the job with a particular reverence, and because Mercer had believed at 25 that the distance between a good cop and a bad one was a matter of individual character rather than institutional design. He was still working out how wrong he had been about that. He had recorded his first conversation 4 months ago. Not because he had a plan he hadn't, but because something Dalton said during a corridor briefing had struck him as so specific and so wrong that he'd pulled out his personal phone and kept it in his breast pocket with the audio running before he fully understood what he was doing. The recording was 40 seconds long and captured Dalton describing a vehicle on the East Corridor with the flat inventory language of a man discussing merchandise rather than a person's property. After that, he kept recording. Not every shift, not every conversation, but the ones that felt wrong in the particular way that had started to accumulate like weight over those 4 months. The coded dispatch language, the apex call times that preceded official stops, Odell's signature approvals that appeared on tow authorizations before any stop had been formally logged. He stored the files on a personal external drive he kept in a lockbox under his bathroom sink, and told himself he was building documentation without yet being willing to name what the documentation was for. The morning of the Clearwater stop, he had watched Dalton take the phones, and he had watched Imani's face when the cuff went on too hard, and he had stood on the sidewalk of Clearwater Avenue holding a surgeon's phone in his hand, feeling the full weight of having become the thing he had joined the force. Specifically, not to become. He called Agent Monk at 4:47 that afternoon from a gas station payphone 2 miles from his apartment, because he did not trust his personal phone, and he did not trust his patrol phone, and he did not fully trust himself except in this one specific way. "My name is Kyle Mercer," he said. "I'm an officer at the 4th Precinct. I have 4 months of recorded audio, and I need to know if you're the right person to give it to." Monk, who had spent the last 2 hours pulling financial threads on Apex Towing and Eastfield Consulting, and had just identified the auction record for Dr. Raymond Osie's vehicle, went very still. "Officer Mercer," he said carefully, "I am exactly the right person. Tell me where you are." They met 40 minutes later at a coffee shop on Tillman Street. Mercer came in wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small, hard-sided case that he set on the table between them without ceremony. Inside was the external drive and a handwritten log, dates, times, officer names, dispatch codes, cross-referenced against the tow records Mercer had quietly copied from the precinct's shared system over the previous 6 weeks. Monk opened the log and read the first page without speaking. Then he read the second page. Then he looked up at Mercer with the expression of a man who has just found the structural beam he was looking for inside a wall he was about to demolish. "This is 4 months, Monk said. "Yes." "And you've been inside the system the whole time?" "Yes." "Why today?" Mercer looked at the table. "Because today they did it to a surgeon and a federal prosecutor on a public street at 8 in the morning with 6 cars and a tow truck that showed up before anyone made an official call. And there's a video. And I stood there and held her phone and did nothing." He paused. "I have a recording of Dalton from this morning, taken before the stop." Monk set down the log. "Play it." Mercer pulled out his personal phone, navigated to the file, and pressed play. The audio was clear, captured in the cruiser before Dalton activated his lights. The two of them sitting at the corner of Clearwater and 9th, the 2 bikes visible moving down the block in front of them. Dalton's voice came through the small speaker with perfect, damning clarity. 2 bikes on the East Corridor. Ninja ZX6Rs. High value. Clean plates means clean money. Easy pick. Call it into Apex now so they're ready. The coffee shop noise continued around them. 2 women at the next table were discussing a recipe. A child near the window was drawing on a paper placemat. The ordinary world kept moving at its ordinary pace, while Monk sat with the recording playing, and felt the case fully assemble itself in his mind, like a structure that had always been there, waiting for the right light. Dalton had not been reacting to suspicious behavior. He had not been responding to a report, or following a lead, or making a judgment call in a difficult situation. He had seen 2 black women on expensive motorcycles, and he had called the tow truck before he ever turned on his lights. The stop was not the beginning of the operation. The stop was the harvest. Monk pressed stop on the audio. He looked at Mercer for a moment. "You understand what you're doing," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," Mercer said. His voice was steady in the way that things are steady when a decision has finally been fully made and the shaking is over. "Then I need everything. The drive, the log, the recordings, all of it. And I need your formal statement tonight." Mercer slid the hard case across the table. Monk picked up his phone and called the U.S. Attorney's office. 42 miles away, Zara Cole was sitting at her kitchen table with her paper cup flattened in front of her, transferring every pressed impression into a legal pad in clear, precise handwriting. Her phone returned to her before she left the precinct at Haywood's insistence was charging on the counter beside her. Imani sat across from her with an ice pack on her wrist and her own notebook open, writing the medical timeline of her injury in the structured language of a physician documenting a case. Ruth Cole sat at the head of the table watching both her daughters work and said nothing because there were no words that fit what she was feeling. And she had always believed that silence used correctly was its own form of strength. None of them knew yet about the recording. None of them knew yet what Dalton had said in that cruiser before he ever turned on his lights. But Zara looked up from the legal pad at one point, and something in her eyes had the quality of a person who has already understood the shape of what happened even before the proof has arrived to confirm it. "It wasn't random," she said. Imani looked at her across the table. "No," she said. "It never is." Zara filed her formal complaint with the FBI at 7:14 that evening. She did not use the precinct's internal affairs process. She did not call the department's civilian review board. She went directly to the federal level because she understood with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years prosecuting public corruption that internal complaint systems inside compromised departments were not mechanisms for accountability. They were mechanisms for delay. She had seen it too many times from the other side of the courtroom. A complaint filed internally was a complaint that could be managed, rerouted, documented as received and under review, and quietly buried under the weight of procedural language while the people responsible continued their work undisturbed. She typed her statement in 94 minutes on her personal laptop, single-spaced 11 pages, with timestamps drawn from the impressions on the paper cup, and the timeline she and Imani had reconstructed together at the kitchen table. She included Dalton's exact words, Odell's exact words, the sequence of the stop, the arrival time of the Apex truck, the removal of her registration documents without receipt, the denial of the phone call, the injury to Imani's wrist, the temperature of the room, the number of ceiling tiles, the name on the badge of the officer who walked her in. She included everything, because she had learned from every case she had ever prosecuted that the details that seemed small were often the ones that held the structure together when everything else was being contested. She sent it to Agent Monk at 7:48 with a single line in the subject field, formal complaint, and supporting documentation, Cole v. Eastfield, PD, 4th Precinct. Monk was already at the U.S. Attorney's Office when it arrived. He had spent the 4 hours since meeting with Mercer, building the warrant application with 2 staff attorneys and a financial crimes analyst who had pulled the full transaction history for Eastfield Consulting LLC and cross-referenced it against Apex Towing's quarterly revenue filings. The picture that emerged was not subtle. Over 14 months, Apex Towing had generated $387,000 in storage fees, auction proceeds, and forfeiture transfers from vehicles seized in stops along the Clearwater corridor. Of that, $41,500 had moved through Eastfield Consulting LLC into accounts connected to Odell, a separate cash payment trail documented in a handwritten ledger that Mercer had photographed with his personal phone during a late shift 6 weeks earlier when Dalton had left it on his desk, showed per-stop payments to Dalton ranging from $200 to $500 depending on vehicle value. Monk presented the application to Judge Carlton Reeves at 9:17 that evening. Judge Reeves was 70 years old, a federal district judge with 41 years on the bench, and the particular quality of attention that came from a lifetime of separating evidence from argument. He read the application in full, asked 4 clarifying questions, and signed the warrant at 9:41. The warrant covered Apex Towing's physical premises and records, Eastfield Consulting LLC's banking records, Odell's department-issued devices and personal financial accounts and the 4th Precinct's internal dispatch logs for the prior 14 months. Monk called Haywood at 9:43. "We move at 11, he said. "I'll have 2 internal affairs officers standing by," she said, off the precinct's main communication channel. "Be good. And Patricia, thank you for calling me this afternoon." A pause. "I just did what should have been done a long time ago," she said, and ended the call. By 10 o'clock, the video Marcus Webb had posted that morning had crossed 4.7 million views. The hashtag Free Zara Imani had been used in over 200,000 posts. 3 national news networks had picked up the story. 2 civil rights organizations had issued formal statements. The Eastfield City Council had scheduled an emergency session for Monday morning at Councilwoman Pruitt's insistence. None of that was what would bring the operation down. What would bring it down was the warrant. The public pressure was the sound of justice arriving. The warrant was the door. Imani had fallen asleep on Zara's couch at 9:30, with an ice pack still resting on her wrist and her notebook open on her chest. The last entry written in the careful shorthand of a physician who documented even when exhausted. Ruth Cole had gone home at 9, not because she wanted to, but because both her daughters told her she needed sleep, and she was too tired to argue effectively. She left with the particular expression of a mother who is proud and devastated in equal measure and cannot fully separate the two. Zara sat alone at the kitchen table after they were gone and read through her complaint one more time. Not to change anything, she would not change anything, but because there was a discipline in rereading that she had learned from years of case preparation, the discipline of sitting with what had happened without the softening effect of distance or time. She thought about Dalton's face when he had looked at her registration documents and folded them into his pocket. She thought about the way Odell had asked where she got the money for the motorcycle with the tone of a man asking a question he already believed he knew the answer to. She thought about Imani's wrist and the 9 marks on the paper cup and the 5 hours of a Saturday morning taken from 2 women who had done nothing wrong. She thought about Dr. Raymond Osei, whose car she had not yet heard about, but whose name was already in Monk's file, and about the 10 other people whose names she did not yet know, but whose vehicles had been taken by the same mechanism through the same corridor, at the instruction of the same recorded voice. She thought about all of it without looking away, because looking away had never been an option she was willing to take. Then she closed her laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on Imani. Her sister was asleep, breathing steadily, the notebook still open on her chest. Zara lifted it gently and set it on the coffee table. She looked at the last entry Imani had written before falling asleep. It said in her surgeon's precise shorthand, contusion right dorsal wrist, caused by restraint applied with excessive force. Documented, will not be minimized. Zara stood there for a moment in the quiet apartment. Then she went to the window and looked out at Eastfield in the dark. The streetlights, the closed storefronts, the ordinary geometry of a city that contained somewhere in its structure something that had been quietly taking from people for over a year. At 11:03, federal agents and internal affairs officers moved simultaneously on Apex Towing and Recovery. Apex Towing and Recovery occupied a 2-acre lot behind a chain-link fence on Industrial Corridor Road, lit by sodium floodlights that turned everything inside a pale, flat yellow. The lot held 63 vehicles when federal agents arrived at 11:03 that Saturday night. Work trucks and family sedans, a minivan with a child's soccer ball still visible through the rear window, a vintage burgundy Cadillac with a rosary hanging from the mirror. 2 red and black Kawasaki Ninja ZX-6Rs parked side by side near the south fence. The office was a single-story prefabricated structure at the lot's entrance. The lights were still on inside. Monk went through the front door with 4 agents and a financial crimes analyst warrant visible at 11:04. The man behind the counter was not the owner. The owner, Curtis Lyle, would not be located for another 40 minutes, but a night manager named Gary Pratt, who had worked for Apex for 3 years, and who looked at the warrant with the expression of someone who had always suspected this moment might arrive and had never fully prepared for it. "We're going to need access to your records room and your dispatch system," Monk said. "All of it. Tonight." Pratt said nothing. He stepped aside. The records room was a converted storage closet behind the main office, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units filled with accordion folders, organized by month and then by vehicle. A financial crimes analyst named Renee Cho began photographing folder contents at 11:11 and did not stop for 3 hours. What she found was not hidden. It was organized, dated, and labeled with the flat efficiency of a business that had operated long enough to feel untouchable. Each folder contained a tow authorization, a vehicle assessment form, a storage fee schedule, and an auction processing sheet. The vehicle assessment forms had a field labeled Estimated Value and a second field labeled Recovery Category. Recovery categories ran from C Low Value Standard Process up to A+, which was defined in a small printed key taped to the inside of the cabinet door as High Value Expedite Auction Priority Fee Schedule. Both Kawasaki Ninjas were filed under A+. Dr. Raymond Ossie's BMW, a 3-year-old 540i, that had been seized 3 weeks earlier after a stop on the same corridor by Officer Dalton, impounded on the grounds of an unverified insurance question, and auctioned at 11 days after seizure before Ossie could navigate the fee and documentation requirements, was filed under A+ as well. His folder contained a note in handwriting that matched the notation style throughout the other folders. Owner contacted, insufficient response, proceed to auction per standard. Dr. Ossie had contacted Apex 6 times by phone and twice in person during those 11 days. Cho found the call log in the same folder. Each call had been marked "No Resolution" in a column that appeared to have been designed specifically to document inaction as procedure. Monk stood in the records room at 11:47 and looked at the shelving units. 23 folders with A+ classifications. Over 14 months. 23 vehicles owned by people who had been stopped along the same corridor by officers connected to the same precinct, towed by the same company, and processed through a fee and auction system, calibrated to move faster than most working people could respond. He pulled out his phone and called Haywood. 23, he said. A silence. 23 vehicles. 23 confirmed A+ classifications. There may be more in the lower categories that follow the same pattern. We'll know by morning. Curtis Lyle was located at 1241, not at his home address, but at a storage unit facility on the west side of the city, where he had driven after receiving a phone call. The origin of the call was later traced to a prepaid phone purchased 2 weeks earlier at a gas station on Route 9, registered to no one, that had apparently warned him something was coming. He was in the process of removing a metal lockbox from the storage unit when 2 agents arrived. He looked at them and set the lockbox down with the careful deliberateness of a man performing a calculated surrender. Inside the lockbox, $23,400 in cash, a second ledger more detailed than the one Mercer had photographed, and a USB drive. The drive contained digital copies of every authorization form, every auction record, and every transfer document going back to the operation's first month. It also contained a folder of email correspondence between Lyle and a recipient identified only by initials in the file names FO, that included 17 messages over 14 months discussing stop volumes, vehicle values, fee schedules, and quarterly distributions. FO was not difficult to identify. Odell was arrested at his home on Garfield Street at 1:17 in the morning. He came to the door in a bathrobe and slippers, and when the agent at the front told him what was happening, his face did not show the shock of a man who was surprised. It showed the resignation of a man who had always known the architecture was impermanent and had spent 14 months hoping the deadline was further away than it turned out to be. Dalton was arrested at 6:40 in the morning at his home on Prescott Drive. He came out of his front door into the pale early light in a gray sweatshirt and basketball shorts, already talking, already explaining, already using the word procedure before any agent had said a single word to him. An agent placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the waiting vehicle, and he kept talking all the way to the door. Nobody responded to anything he said. By 7:14, other officers from the 4th Precinct had been placed on administrative suspension pending federal review. Chief Haywood issued the suspensions herself, signing each one by hand, working through the stack of papers at her desk in the quiet of the early morning, with the focused expression of a person doing necessary and painful work. Councilwoman Pruitt arrived at Haywood's office at 7:30 with 2 cups of coffee and said nothing for the first 5 minutes, because she understood that some silences were not empty. They were full of things that did not yet have the right words. At 8:06, the 2 red and black Kawasaki Ninjas were released from the Apex lot into federal custody pending evidence processing. An agent photographed them in place before the release. In the photograph, they stood side by side near the south fence in the pale early morning light, exactly as they had been left waiting. Monk sent the photograph to Haywood with one line, "They're still here." Haywood forwarded it to Zara's phone without adding anything. Zara was awake when it arrived. She looked at it for a long time. Then she woke Imani. The federal grand jury returned indictments on a Tuesday morning in late September, 4 months after the Saturday on Clearwater Avenue that had started everything. Brett Dalton, Frank Odell, and Curtis Lyle were each charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, wire fraud extortion under color of official right, and asset forfeiture fraud. 6 additional officers from the 4th Precinct faced charges of knowing participation or willful failure to intervene. Dale Lyle, who had managed the data infrastructure that kept the dispatch logs from raising flags, was charged separately with obstruction of justice and destruction of records. The indictments were 41 pages long. They named 23 victims by name. They quantified the total financial harm at $412,000 in seized vehicle value storage fees and auction proceeds extracted from people who had committed no crime. Dr. Raymond Osei was the first name on the victim list. He was a 47-year-old cardiologist who had emigrated from Ghana at 22 and had spent the following 25 years building a life of meticulous honesty in a country that had now formally acknowledged in 41 pages of federal documentation that one of its systems had taken from him deliberately and without justification. He sat in the courthouse gallery on the morning the indictments were read, and did not speak to anyone, but at one point during the reading of the charges, he pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling in the way people do when they are trying to hold something inside that is too large for the space available. Zara was seated 2 rows behind him. She saw it. She looked away to give him privacy. The trial began in February and lasted 19 days. Kyle Mercer testified for 4 hours on the 8th day. He had resigned from the 4th Precinct 2 weeks after the arrests and was working as a security consultant while his own role in the operation was under review. A review that ultimately resulted in no criminal charges given his cooperation, his recordings, and the documented timeline of his decision to come forward. He testified without drama or self-justification, walking the jury through 4 months of recordings with the straightforward economy of a man who was not asking to be seen as heroic, only as honest. Dalton's attorney argued that the stops were based on legitimate officer discretion and that the connection to Apex Towing was coincidental. He argued this for 3 days against the weight of the recording made in the cruiser on Clearwater Avenue, 2 bikes on the East Corridor. High value, clean plates means clean money, easy pick. Call it in to Apex now, so they're ready. which the jury heard 6 times across 3 separate days of testimony, and which made the word coincidental increasingly difficult to sustain. Zara testified on the 14th day. She wore a dark blue suit and spoke for 2 hours and 12 minutes without notes, because the events of that Saturday were organized in her memory with the same precision she brought to every case she had ever prosecuted, except that this time she was not the prosecutor. She was the person to whom something had been done. That distinction, she had discovered in the months between the stop and the trial, required a different kind of discipline. Not the cold management of evidence, but the willingness to stand in front of strangers and say plainly, "This happened to me, and it was wrong, and I will not reduce it to make you comfortable." She did not reduce it. Imani testified the following day. She described the morning with the clinical precision of a physician and the emotional accuracy of a person who had had 4 months to understand exactly what had been taken from them. Not just time, not just the use of a morning, but the particular safety of moving through a city without calculating risk, the ease of assuming that a clear conscience was sufficient protection. She described what it felt like to reach for her hospital badge, to offer the thing that was supposed to explain her, to hold up the credential that was supposed to translate her existence into a language that required no further justification, and to watch Dalton look at it and say anybody can print a badge. She said it plainly without performance. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned guilty verdicts on all primary counts for Dalton O'Dell and Curtis Lyle. The additional officers received mixed verdicts on lesser charges. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Dalton received 11 years. O'Dell received 8. Curtis Lyle received 7. The financial restitution ordered totaled $412,000 to be distributed to the 23 named victims. Dr. Osei received the value of his auctioned BMW plus documented losses from missed work and legal fees. He did not smile when the number was read. He nodded once the way a person nods when they receive something they were always owed, and the receiving of it does not cancel the owing. The city of Eastfield settled a separate civil rights lawsuit filed by Zara and Imani Cole for an amount that was not disclosed publicly with the settlement, including a requirement for mandatory body camera use by all patrol officers, an independent audit of towing contracts, an annual review of traffic stop demographics, and the permanent dissolution of the 4th Precinct's administrative structure under O'Dell's former model. Chief Haywood oversaw the restructuring personally. She instituted a new policy requiring any tow authorization to be cross-referenced with a filed incident report before a towing company could be dispatched. And she removed Apex Towing from the city's vendor list the morning after the indictments were returned. Zara was appointed to the city's newly formed Independent Police Oversight Board in October. She accepted the position without ceremony because she understood that the work that came after a verdict was harder and slower and less visible than the work that preceded it, and that it mattered more. Imani established the Cole Legal Defense Fund in November, with a portion of the civil settlement a non-profit providing free legal representation to Eastfield residents whose vehicles had been seized in disputed traffic stops. In its first 3 months, it handled 19 cases. 16 of them resulted in vehicle returns or financial restitution. Marcus Webb was not a plaintiff and received nothing from the legal proceedings. He was asked in an interview what it had felt like to press record that morning on Clearwater Avenue. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "Like doing the only thing that made sense. My daughter's out there on those roads. Somebody had to." Ruth Cole hosted a dinner in December. Both daughters came. Dr. Osei came brought by Councilwoman Pruitt and sat at the table with the quiet ease of a man who had been carrying something heavy and had set it down somewhere it would not be lost. Marcus Webb came with his daughter, who was 20 years old and studying pre-law, and asked Zara 17 questions over the course of the evening without stopping. Ruth made cornbread dressing and sweet potato pie, and said grace in the particular way she had always said it, briefly, without theater, as if speaking to someone she knew personally and trusted to understand what was meant. After dinner, Zara and Imani stood in the driveway for a few minutes before Imani left. "Saturday," Imani said. Zara looked at her. Saturday. They rode Highway 9 together the following weekend. The same route, the same morning quiet, the same breakfast at Nell's table where the owner brought their order without asking. The road had not changed. The city had not been remade. The systems that failed them had been documented and partially corrected and would require continued watching and pressure for years to come. But they were on the road, and no one had the power to make them believe they did not belong there.
Two women did nothing wrong. They simply existed visibly confidently in full ownership of what they had earned, and that was enough to make them targets. This story is not about exceptional people winning against impossible odds. It is about what becomes possible when ordinary courage meets documentation solidarity and the refusal to be silent. Dignity is not a reward for achievement, it is a birthright. And when systems are built to deny it, the most radical act is to keep moving anyway, steadily, clearly, and without apology. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you're feeling right now. Your voice in this space matters more than you know, and if you believe these stories need to be heard, subscribe and share, because the next story might be the one that changes something for someone near you.